Morning YouTube, this is going to serve as my third and final response vis-a-vis my opening statements on the Presumption of Atheism series I did in collaboration with Veritas and Dawahfilms, this specific video going to theoretical BS. So let's jump right in. Now Scott, I'm going to actually jump over a large portion of your video, namely the beginning, and I do this because I think enough has been said on the topic of negative atheism by parties on all sides, and I would agree with you that it is more of a peripheral point comparatively to the aphorism, so I'm going to focus on that in my video response, and I trust that this will be fine with you given your statements on atheism. Now this takes us to the second contention held by Veritas 48, Dawahfilms, and myself, that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence vis-a-vis God. Now, it was argued by myself and Veritas, as well as Dawahfilms, that the aphorism would only justify the move to there is no God if the two scriven criteria were met, those being the evidence and knowledge expectation criterion. It was noted that in order for justification to obtain, that atheists must show that God meets these two criteria, and theists in turn must also demonstrate that God does not meet these two criteria. Now, you specifically objected to the argument Veritas 48 gave that God does not meet these two criteria. Veritas's argument was it could be the case that God is not interested in being overtly transparent because he is more interested in other aspects of his creation. You objected that because of the character of the Christian God. So to this I have a few thoughts. First, it is important to reemphasize that Veritas 48, Dawahfilms, and myself were arguing for more of a theistic conception of God and not specifically the Christian faith. It should seem obvious that we couldn't argue for the Christian faith, as Dawahfilms follows Islam, whereas Veritas 48 and myself follow Christianity. Thus, assuming for the sake of argument for a moment that your objection does apply to Christianity, it still seems to be the case that what you addressed is Christianity and not the broader thesis that we were in fact presenting, namely that on the broad theistic conception of God, the move from absence of evidence to evidence of absence does not justify or provide justification for the position of non-belief. So in light of the broader definition, I think your argument as formulated fails to obtain to our broad thesis. Now, you do state towards the end of your response that, quote, even if the absence of evidence for a given God were not evidence of its absence, it would still be evidence that the belief in that God is unreasonable. And that's the only position that any theist, or atheist, of any kind has to demonstrate in order to win the argument, end quote. Yet I don't see how that follows. Let me argue from illustration here. Given that we don't have evidence for gold on Pluto, would it follow that a scientist's belief that there is gold on Pluto be unreasonable? Now, contrary to what you postulate, I think it's reasonable for such a belief to be maintained in this situation, since there is no contrary evidence being offered, only lack of evidence for the positive belief. Likewise, you state the aphorism renders belief unreasonable even if it doesn't prove to be evidence against God's existence. However, unless there is some positive argument you are thinking of that you forgot to mention to render that belief unreasonable, then the aphorism renders neither belief unreasonable, whether it be gold or God. Second, Noah's argument was not the only argument provided as to why God does not meet the two scriven criteria of knowledge and evidence expectation. First, I provided two arguments from hypothesis confirmation that argued, one, the move from absence of evidence to evidence of absence is not justified in light of multiple rivaling hypotheses, and two, the aphorism seems to be an example of a dubious inductive premise to a universal claim, in that, given the different hypotheses of God, theism, atheism, pantheism, it would be very hard to make a decisive case for any of the theories by appealing solely to the evidence in question, i.e. the lack thereof, while ignoring, say, our background knowledge of the universe. For example, the universe is ordered and susceptible to rational investigation. 2. Contains consciousness. And 3. Free agency. Second, I argued that given that future progression in knowledge requires present ignorance, it would seem that we should not expect to have evidence for God, as our current understanding could be incomplete or false. Thus, the evidence and knowledge criterion are not met. Concisely then, Noah's argument as to why God does not meet the scriven criteria were not in any way exclusive. However, I don't want to dismiss your objections totally, as I am a Christian theist and would instead like to address your arguments directly, so this is my third point. You state that, quote, what this is about, though, is the fact that a case can be made that the absence of evidence is indeed evidence of absence when it comes to your God, that being the Christian God. You argue for this in two ways. First, on the Christian conception of God, you establish the personal and caring nature of said God, exemplified by such things as 1. God's desire for all to be saved, 2. God's desire for us not to suffer in hell, and 3. The explicable 100% proof would in no way inhibit our free will, but would accomplish 1 and 2. Second, you argue that, quote, it is also not true that a God's disinterest in making its existence clear entails that we shouldn't expect to see evidence for its existence, end quote, and you exemplify this with the illustration of a perfect manufacturer and his product. I'll start with your second argument first. You state that it would probably be the case that given the perfection of the designer, the product should also exemplify these characteristics, and further, that for any hypothesis we start with what we see and not what we ought to see. Now, first, since we are discussing the Christian conception of God, the theological argument could be simply that such a perfect world was crafted, but secondary to the fall, it's been tarnished. Second, it's simply false that for any given hypothesis we start with what we see, not what we should see. There are at least 2 instances I can think of that would exemplify this. The first is ethical hypotheses, which focus on what ought to be the case, and not exclusively what is the case. And 2, any hypotheses attempting to use or account for logic starts with what ought to be rational, and not what is, for if logic is merely descriptive, then we are in loads of trouble. So it's simply false that, quote, your reasoning as a Christian apologist predicated upon the assumption that if a perfect creator did exist, it would create this universe, not a perfect one, and you work from there, end quote. That's not true. Now, as to your initial portion of your argument regarding the personal and involved nature of God, you seem to think that if God were to write his name in the stars or on every atom, or in some way demonstrate that his existence is explicable and 100% true, that everyone would come into a relationship with God. What I will agree to here is that 100% explicable proof would lead the reasonable to propositional belief that God exists. However, such evidence would in no way guarantee that individuals would be led into meritorious belief in God. Now you see, this is properly demonstrated by, and at the risk of introducing another atheistic term, the practical atheist who may believe that God exists, but lives as though he didn't. Now, said atheist may very well be persuaded by the evidences, but does not live his life according to the way he ought to. In other words, said atheist has propositional belief that God exists, but he does not have meritorious belief in God. Now, appealing to theological arguments, it also seems to be the case that there are individuals who experience God directly and yet still lacked meritorious belief, for example, the king Belshazzar and Daniel. Hence we can argue as follows. 1. Given a major drive behind the Christian faith is to establish a relationship with God, meritorious belief is more important than propositional belief. And 2. Practical atheists and King Belshazzar are 2 examples of individuals that conjure propositional belief, but not meritorious belief, given the convincing evidence of God's existence. Therefore, 3. It is not strictly the case that 100% exclusive evidence would convince every rational person towards meritorious belief, which is what God desires. Moreover, I think a strong case can be argued that God establishing irrefutable proof of his existence would lead to coercive belief and not actual free choice. Now, the way you worded the notion that such evidence would not lead to inhibition of free will leads me to think that you would argue this point, but since I'm about out of time, and given that there will be ample time for you to argue this point in the next few weeks, I'll simply state that I disagree, and given a chance to respond to you in the future, I'll lay out my argument then. However, until then, I don't believe that the aphorism is indicative that Christianity is false, and moreover, I would reemphasize that there are other arguments for why God does not meet the scriven criteria, and that the major thesis of this project was seemingly not addressed. Thank you for your contribution to the discussion, Scott, and peace to all.